There are people inside royal palaces who have seen everything. They have stood in hallways during arguments that never made the news. They have watched doors close on conversations that the public was never meant to hear. They have carried trays of tea into rooms where decisions were being made, decisions that would quietly reshape the lives of people the whole world was watching. These insiders rarely speak. Their silence is part of the job. It is expected, enforced, and, in many cases, bought. But, sometimes, after years of watching something unfold from the inside, a person reaches a point where staying quiet feels like becoming part of the problem. And, that is exactly what happened here. A former member of the royal household, someone who worked in close proximity to the family for several years, began making quiet, careful statements to people they trusted. Not to tabloids. Not to gossip sites. To people who listened and, eventually connected those statements to a pattern that was already visible to anyone paying close attention. The pattern pointed in one direction. It pointed toward a young girl with a natural talent, a growing dream, and a step-grandmother who seemed, in the eyes of those watching closely, to be standing directly in her path. Princess Charlotte is 13 years old. She is the daughter of the Prince and Princess of Wales. She is also, by all accounts from people who have spent time around her, genuinely gifted when it comes to performance. Her interest in acting and film has not been hidden. It has been observed at school events, noted by teachers, mentioned in private conversations that have slowly made their way outward. Those who know her describe a child who is not simply starstruck by Hollywood the way most children are. They describe someone who understands storytelling, who pays attention to character, who watches films with the kind of focus that goes beyond entertainment. This is not a hobby she stumbled into. It is something that has been growing in her quietly and consistently for years. The question of whether a child born into the British royal family could ever pursue a professional creative career is not a simple one. The institution has rules, both written and unwritten. It has expectations that are passed down not through instruction manuals but through atmosphere and pressure and the long, slow weight of tradition. A future princess, one who will carry titles, attend state functions, and represent the crown, is not typically someone who also goes to auditions or takes meetings in Los Angeles. The two worlds are not designed to coexist. And, yet Charlotte's parents, William and Catherine, have never been the kind of royals who automatically accept the limits the institution tries to place on their children. They have fought, quietly but consistently, for something that previous generations of royals rarely got to have: a childhood that belongs to the child. That fight has apparently intensified. And, according to the person who broke their silence, it has intensified specifically because of Camilla. Queen Camilla has occupied one of the most complicated positions in modern royal history. She entered the family as the woman Charles loved during his marriage to Diana, survived the hatred of a public that never fully forgave her, and eventually earned a version of acceptance that few people believed was possible. She became queen consort when Charles acceded to the throne. She is now, formally and officially, the queen. That title comes with real power, not constitutional power, perhaps, but the kind of soft, atmospheric power that operates through influence and access and the ability to shape how things are discussed in private. And she has, according to sources close to the family, been using that power in ways that have begun to trouble people around her. The specific concern raised by the former household member centers on Charlotte's path. Not just her interest in Hollywood, but her broader future, the way her role within the institution is being quietly shaped in conversations that Charlotte herself is not part of. What was described was a pattern of Camilla inserting herself into discussions about the children's futures in ways that were not requested and not welcomed. Not loudly. Not in ways that could be easily confronted. But consistently, and with a specificity that made clear she had thought about it and had opinions she intended to make known. The insider described one moment in particular that stuck with them. It was a conversation overheard rather than participated in which Camilla made a comment about Charlotte's interests that was framed as concern but landed as dismissal. The comment was not about whether Charlotte was talented. It was about whether certain interests were appropriate for someone in Charlotte's position. The phrasing, as it was described, was careful and polished and carried the unmistakable tone of someone who believed they had the right to weigh in on the matter. William, who was present, reportedly did not respond warmly. This is not the first time tension between William and Camilla has surfaced. Their relationship has been complicated since before Charles and Camilla married. William was, for a long time, one of the more resistant members of the family when it came to accepting Camilla's presence and, eventually, her title. He made peace with the situation over the years, at least on the surface, because that is what the institution requires and because his father's happiness mattered to him. But, making peace with a situation is not the same as trusting the person at the center of it. And, the distinction, according to people who have observed them together, has never entirely disappeared. What makes this particular conflict different from the general friction that exists in any blended family, even one that happens to live in palaces, is the stakes. Charlotte is not simply a teenager navigating the complicated feelings that come with a step-grandparent's opinions. She is a public figure who will one day carry an enormous institutional role. The decisions being made about her now, the paths being opened or closed, the interests being encouraged or quietly discouraged, these decisions have long-term consequences that go far beyond what is normal in a family disagreement. And, when a person with the title and influence of queen begins weighing in on those decisions without being asked, the people who love Charlotte most apparently start paying very close attention. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, has been described by people around her as fiercely protective of her children in a way that is entirely deliberate. She grew up watching what the institution did to Diana. She has spent her entire adult life learning how the machinery of the royal family works, where its pressures come from, and how to position herself and her children within it in a way that protects them without provoking an open confrontation she cannot win. She does not fight loudly. She fights strategically, patiently, and with a precision that people consistently underestimate because she does it with a smile. The fact that Charlotte's interests have been allowed to develop as openly as they have, that they are known, discussed, described by sources, suggests that Catherine has been quietly but actively protecting that space. The former household member who broke silence did not describe Catherine as panicked or reactive. They described her as aware. Aware of what was happening, aware of who was saying what, and aware that the time for quiet patience might be running out. The thing that reportedly changed the temperature of the situation was not a single dramatic confrontation. It was the accumulation. It was the sense, growing among those closest to William and Catherine, that the interference was not going to stop on its own, that someone was going to have to say something, and that saying it through proper channels inside the institution was not going to be enough. Charlotte herself, from everything that has been described, does not fully understand what is happening around her. She is 13. She knows she loves something. She knows her parents support her. She does not, as far as anyone has indicated, know that there are conversations happening at a level above her head about whether that love will be allowed to grow into something real. That particular layer of the story, a child dreaming without knowing how many adults are arguing about the dream, is perhaps the part that moved the former insider enough to speak at all. Because that is what this story is really about, underneath the titles and the palace politics and the institutional friction. It is about whether a girl gets to want something. It is about who has the right to weigh in on that wanting. It is about what happens when the people who are supposed to protect a child's future disagree about what the future should look like, and one of those people has a crown. The royal guard who broke silence did not do so recklessly. The timing of what they shared, the way it was framed, the details they included, and the ones they deliberately left out, all of it suggests someone who thought carefully about what they were doing and why. They were not trying to damage Camilla. They were not, as far as anyone could determine, acting out of personal grievance. They were describing something they believed was wrong, using the only tool available to a person who no longer has access to the room where the decisions are made. What happens next depends on a number of things, some of them inside the palace, some of them outside it. Charlotte is still young. Her path is not yet fixed. The space her parents have created for her interests could still expand into something real, or it could be gradually narrowed by the weight of expectation and the soft, persistent pressure of people who believe they know what a future princess should and should not want. But, right now, in this moment, someone has said out loud what others have only whispered. And, once that happens, once the silence breaks, even partially, even carefully, the air in the room changes. The people doing the pressuring know they are being watched. The people being protected know they are not alone. And a 13-year-old girl in a palace somewhere, who loves stories and screens and the particular magic of becoming someone else for a little while, keeps dreaming without knowing how many people are fighting to protect that right. That is where this story begins. Not at the end of something. At the beginning of a confrontation that has been building for years, involving people who carry some of the most famous names in the world, centered on a question that is both enormously complicated and almost heartbreakingly simple. Does Charlotte get to choose? The answer to that question is not yet written. But the people who intend to write it are no longer all on the same side. To understand why Charlotte's situation has become as complicated as it has, you have to understand something about how the royal family actually works, not the version you see on balconies and in official photographs, but the version that operates in private, in the spaces between public appearances, in the meeting rooms and drawing rooms and long corridors where real decisions get made. The institution is not a democracy. It is not even, in the truest sense, a family in the way most people understand families. It is a hierarchy dressed in warmth, a structure of power wrapped in the language of tradition and duty, and the people inside it have spent generations learning how to navigate it without ever appearing to be navigating it at all. Camilla has spent a very long time learning that navigation. She did not arrive in the royal family as someone who was welcomed. She arrived as someone who was tolerated, then cautiously accepted, then gradually elevated, each step harder than the last, each step requiring her to be more patient and more strategic than almost anyone around her gave her credit for. By the time she became queen, she had survived things that would have destroyed a less determined person. She had weathered public hatred that was, at its worst, genuinely vicious. She had sat through years of being described as the villain of a love story that the world had already decided belonged entirely to Diana. And she had done all of it while maintaining the kind of composure that the institution demands and rewards above almost everything else. That history matters when you try to understand what she is doing now. Because a person who has survived what Camilla survived does not simply become passive when they reach a position of power. They use what they have learned. They apply the patience and the strategy that got them through the difficult years to the situation in front of them. And the situation in front of her, as she apparently sees it, involves a royal family that is preparing for a generational transition, a shift in which the children of William and Catherine will eventually become the most visible and important members of the institution. The shape of that future, from Camilla's perspective, is not a neutral matter. It is something with consequences for everyone, including herself. The concern about Charlotte specifically, the quiet, persistent pressure to steer her away from Hollywood aspirations and toward a more conventional royal path, fits neatly into a larger picture that sources have described in careful detail. It is not simply about Charlotte's acting interests. It is about what Charlotte represents. She is a second child, which means she has slightly more freedom than her brother George, who carries the full weight of succession. That slight freedom has given her room to develop interests and ambitions that a future king simply cannot afford to have. And that room, in the eyes of people who prioritize institutional stability above individual expression, is something that needs to be managed rather than expanded. The word that keeps appearing in accounts from people close to the situation is appropriate. What is appropriate for someone in Charlotte's position? What interests are appropriate for a future senior royal? What kind of public identity is appropriate for the daughter of the future king? It is a word that sounds reasonable on the surface. Of course, there are things that are appropriate and things that are not. Of course, a royal child's public image matters, but underneath the reasonableness is a set of assumptions about who Charlotte is allowed to be that her parents have apparently found increasingly difficult to accept. William has not been silent about this, at least not in private. People who have been in meetings with him describe a prince who has become noticeably less deferential about the direction of his children's lives as his position within the family has grown. He is no longer simply the heir waiting to become king. He is the heir apparent with enormous public support, a popular and capable wife, and 3 children who are among the most watched young people in the world. His tolerance for outside interference in decisions that he and Catherine have made together has, by all accounts, decreased significantly. And the specific interference that has been coming from Camilla's direction, however carefully it is framed, however politely it is delivered, has apparently crossed a line that he did not make public but did make clear. The former royal guard who spoke about this described a dynamic inside the household that was less like an open argument and more like a cold tension, the kind that exists when two parties have stopped pretending to fully agree but have not yet reached the moment where everything gets said out loud. Camilla, as described, was not approaching the situation carelessly. She was operating through the same channels of soft influence she has always used, the comment made in passing, the concern raised in a meeting as though it were general and, not targeted, the opinion shared with someone who would pass it along rather than express directly to the person it was aimed at. It is a method that is extremely difficult to confront directly because it never fully presents itself as a confrontation. What made it visible, eventually, was repetition. One comment about appropriate interests can be dismissed. Two can be noted. A pattern, a persistent, recurring insertion into conversations about Charlotte's future, cannot be easily explained away, and it was that pattern that the insider described with the most clarity. They were not reporting on a single incident. They were describing something they had watched develop over time, something that had become part of the daily atmosphere around the family in a way that troubled them enough to finally say something. Catherine's response to all of this has been, characteristically, to do several things at once. She has continued to support Charlotte's interests openly, in ways that are quiet but deliberate, ensuring that Charlotte has access to the people and experiences that allow her interests to develop, making sure that the space around those interests is protected without drawing direct attention to the fact that it needs protecting. She has also, according to people who know her, been paying extremely close attention to who is saying what and where. She collects information the way the institution trained her to collect it, patiently, without revealing what she knows, holding it until the moment when it becomes useful. There is a version of this story that is simply about palace politics, about the inevitable friction between generations in a family that never fully separates personal relationships from institutional power. That version is real, and it is part of what is happening. But there is another version that sits underneath it, and that version is about something much simpler. It is about a mother watching someone try to quietly dim her daughter's sense of what is possible, and deciding that she is not going to let that happen. Charlotte's interest in performance and storytelling has been described by multiple sources in terms that are notably consistent. She is not, as some have suggested, simply a child who watches too many films. She is someone who engages with stories at a level that is recognizable to people who work in creative fields, the kind of engagement that comes from somewhere real, somewhere internal, somewhere that does not disappear just because the people around you have complicated feelings about it. Her teachers have noticed. Her parents have noticed. And the people who have been quietly working to narrow her path have also noticed, which is precisely why the pressure has been as consistent as it has. The Hollywood dimension of the story is not incidental. It is, in fact, the specific thing that appears to have elevated the concern from general disapproval to active interference. A British royal with an interest in community theatre is manageable. A British royal with ambitions toward a serious Hollywood career is something else entirely. It raises questions about dual identities, about what it means to represent the crown while also representing yourself, about whether the public is prepared to hold both versions of a person in their mind at once. These are not unreasonable questions. But the way they are being raised, and by whom, and in what context, matters enormously. The people around Charlotte who support her path have made a consistent argument that the question of what she ultimately does with her creative interests is years away from needing to be decided, that she is 13 years old and has every right to develop those interests without having their final destination determined in advance, and that the interference being applied right now is not about preparing her for difficult decisions in the future but about making certain decisions for her before she is old enough to make them herself. That argument, which is essentially an argument about agency, about who gets to determine what a young girl's future looks like, is the real center of the conflict. What the former insider made clear, in the account that has since circulated among people paying close attention to this story, is that the interference was not coming from a place of neutral institutional concern. It was coming with an agenda. The agenda was not spelled out explicitly, it never is, in these environments, but it was visible in the specificity of the comments, in the timing of when they were made, in the way they consistently pointed toward the same conclusion. That conclusion was that Charlotte should be guided away from the kind of individual ambition that might, one day, create a narrative around her that existed separately from and, potentially in competition with the institutional narrative the family needed her to embody. A girl who becomes a celebrated Hollywood actress is a girl with her own story. A girl with her own story is, in certain institutional minds, a girl who is harder to manage. And a girl who is harder to manage is, in those same minds, a potential problem. William and Catherine do not share that view. They have been consistent about this, consistent in the way that parents are consistent when they have decided something is not negotiable. They are not asking for permission. They are not seeking approval. They are managing the situation with the tools available to them, which include their own considerable power within the institution and the support of a British public that has watched them parent with an intentionality and warmth that the previous generation rarely demonstrated. But Camilla is also not without tools. She is the queen. She has the ear of the king. She has the accumulated influence of someone who has spent decades learning how to operate within this particular system, and she knows its pressure points better than almost anyone. The fact that this conflict has remained largely below the surface, that it has not exploded into the kind of open confrontation that tabloids would cover breathlessly, suggests that both sides are still playing the long game. Still managing. Still calculating. The former royal guard understood that. They also understood that the long game, in this case, had a time limit. Because Charlotte is not staying 13. She is growing, and, as she grows, the window in which her path can still be shaped by the people around her rather than by her own choices is narrowing. The interference that is happening now, the quiet, persistent, carefully framed pressure, will either succeed in narrowing her sense of what is possible before she is old enough to push back against it, or it will fail because the people protecting her hold the line long enough for her to grow into someone capable of holding it herself. That is the race happening behind the palace walls. Not a race of armies or open declarations. A race of patience and persistence and the quiet, daily work of protecting a dream that has not yet had the chance to fully announce itself to the world. The former guard broke silence because they believed the race was closer than it looked from the outside. Because they had seen the pressure up close and understood that it was more sustained and more deliberate than the public had any way of knowing. And because they believed that the girl at the center of it deserved to have someone say, even quietly, even carefully, this is not right, and people are watching. Whether that matters, whether anyone with the power to change things is listening, is the question the third part of this story will have to answer. There is a photograph that circulated quietly among people who follow this family carefully. It was not staged. It was not arranged by a communications team. It was taken at an event where Charlotte was present, and what it captured was not a formal pose or a practiced wave. It was a moment of pure attention, Charlotte watching something happening on a stage, her face completely unguarded, her eyes focused with the kind of intensity that belongs only to people who are genuinely moved by what they are seeing. It is the face of someone who does not just enjoy stories. It is the face of someone who needs them. Anyone who has ever felt that particular pull, the pull of narrative, of character, of the specific alchemy that happens when a performer connects with an audience, would recognize it immediately. That photograph matters in this context not because it proves anything but because it captures something that cannot be manufactured. You cannot train a child to look like that. You cannot instruct a 13-year-old to feel genuine artistic longing on command for the benefit of a camera. What that photograph shows is a person in the presence of something real, responding to it honestly, not yet aware that her response is being watched or that it will one day become part of a much larger conversation about who she is and who she is going to be allowed to become. The people who want to redirect her path away from Hollywood and toward a more conventional royal identity understand that photograph too. They understand what it means. And that understanding, the recognition that Charlotte's interest is not a phase, not a superficial fascination, not something that can be quietly waited out, is precisely what has made the interference more deliberate and more urgent in recent months. Because here is the thing about genuine talent and genuine passion in a young person, it does not require anyone's permission to grow. It simply grows. It reaches toward the light available to it. And, unless you actively block that light, unless you create conditions in which it cannot find what it needs, it will eventually become impossible to ignore. The people around Charlotte who are trying to manage her trajectory understand this. The question is whether they can create those blocking conditions before she is old enough and confident enough to find her own light independently. William and Catherine have been fighting precisely that blocking. The way they have structured Charlotte's education, the experiences they have made available to her, the quiet permissions they have extended, all of it has been designed to keep the door open that certain people are trying to nudge closed. They have done it without making public declarations. They have done it without inflammatory statements or visible confrontations. They have done it the way Catherine does almost everything important, methodically, patiently, with the long view fully in focus. Sources close to the couple describe a specific shift in approach that happened within the last year. It is a shift that several insiders have noted and that the former Royal Guard's account appears to confirm. William and Catherine have become more deliberate about creating documented record, not in a legal sense, but in the practical sense of ensuring that the things being said and done around Charlotte's future are known by more people than just the people in the room where they happen. The effect of this is that conversations which might previously have stayed entirely within the walls of the household now have more witnesses. More people who can, if necessary, speak to what was said and by whom. This is not an accident. It is a strategy. And it is the kind of strategy you adopt when you have realized that good faith is not sufficient, that the people you are dealing with will continue to operate in the shadows as long as they believe the shadows are private. Bringing more light into the room, even informally, even gradually, changes the calculation. It makes the interference more costly. It raises the risk of the thing that institutional figures fear most in this era, visibility. The former Royal Guard's decision to speak, seen in this context, is not an isolated act. It is one piece of a larger pattern of information moving outward from a household where something has been happening that those inside it no longer believe should stay entirely hidden. It is a sign that the patience of the people who have been watching closely has reached a limit. And it is a signal, subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying attention, that the situation is entering a new phase. What does that new phase look like? It looks, at first, like more of the same. Charlotte still goes to school. She still attends the events required of her. She still smiles for the cameras with the practiced ease of someone who has been doing this since she was old enough to walk. On the surface, nothing appears to have changed. The family is united, composed, and publicly warm in the way that the institution always requires, and the Wales family has always delivered with more apparent sincerity than most. But, underneath that surface, the geometry of the relationships has shifted. The conversations that used to happen in certain rooms are now happening in different rooms, with different people present. The access that certain individuals used to have to discussions about the children's futures has been quietly, carefully reduced. Not dramatically. Not in a way that triggers open conflict. But, reduced, in the way that a door that used to be left open is now left ajar, still technically accessible, but no longer an invitation. People who know Camilla well describe someone who is not unaware of what is happening. She has spent too many years navigating this institution to miss a signal that is being delivered this clearly. Whether she chooses to respond by pulling back, by finding alternative channels, or by escalating in ways that create more visible friction, the choice will shape what the next period looks like for everyone involved. The people around William and Catherine believe she will pull back. Not because she has changed her position, but because she is pragmatic enough to recognize when the cost-benefit calculation has shifted. There is also a third factor that nobody inside the institution can fully control, and that factor is Charlotte herself. She is 13 now. In 5 years she will be 18. The window of time in which adults around her can make decisions about her path without needing her active cooperation is not infinite. It is, in fact, closing at a pace that is consistent and predictable and that everyone involved understands perfectly well. The parents fighting to protect her options know it. The people trying to narrow those options know it. And, somewhere in the middle of all this adult maneuvering, Charlotte herself is growing, not knowing everything that is happening around her, but not entirely unaware either. Children who grow up inside institutions like the royal family develop a sensitivity to the undercurrents of the adults around them that is almost preternatural. They learn to read rooms. They learn to sense when a conversation shifts register, when a smile is performing something different from what it appears to be performing, when the warmth in a space is real and when it is managed. Charlotte has been developing that sensitivity her entire life. She does not need to be told explicitly what is happening to sense the shape of it. And that sense, that growing awareness that something is being contested around her future, even if she cannot fully name what, is itself a kind of education. The people who love her want her to grow into that awareness gently, with enough security and enough evidence of her parents' protection that it does not frighten her or harden her before she has had the chance to simply be young. That is the part of this story that most of the public never sees, not the palace politics, not the power dynamics, not the institutional calculations, but the quiet daily work of two parents trying to give their daughter a childhood that is both honest about what she is and protective enough that what she is does not become a burden before she is ready to carry it. Catherine, in particular, has been described by people close to her as someone who thinks about Charlotte's emotional architecture with a deliberateness that goes beyond what most parents have the bandwidth or the self-awareness to sustain. She thinks about what Charlotte is absorbing, what messages she is receiving not just from explicit conversations but from observation, from atmosphere, from the way the adults around her treat each other and treat her. She is building something in her daughter. Not just skills or opportunities or a platform, but a foundation of self-knowledge and security that is meant to be strong enough to hold whatever the future brings. That future, as it now appears, may genuinely include Hollywood in some form. Not a secret side career hidden from the institution, that would be impossible and everyone knows it. But something more nuanced, more considered, more reflective of a generation that has grown up watching the line between public duty and personal identity be renegotiated in real time. There are models for this. There are precedents, outside the British monarchy, for how a person can carry a public institutional role and a genuine creative identity simultaneously without either one destroying the other. Whether those models are applicable to Charlotte's specific situation, given the particular pressures and expectations of her position, is something that will take years to work out. But the working out requires that the possibility remain open. It requires that the people around Charlotte not decide, on her behalf and, without her input, that the answer is no before the question has even been properly asked. That is the specific harm that the former royal guard described, not a catastrophic event, not a visible crisis, but the quiet, incremental narrowing of a young person's sense of what is possible for her. The harm of being managed out of your own future by people who have decided they know better. William knows this harm personally. He has described, in interviews that have stayed with people because of their unusual candor, what it felt like to grow up having so much of his life predetermined. He has talked about the work he has had to do to find genuine agency within constraints that were never fully of his choosing. He has made it clear, through what he says and through what he does, that he does not want that experience to define his children's lives the way it defined his. That intention is real. It is one of the things about him that even people who are not natural royalists tend to find genuinely moving. And Catherine, who watched her own life be scrutinized and managed and contested and survived it with her sense of self remarkably intact, Catherine understands in a different but equally real way what it means for a woman to fight for the right to define herself rather than be defined by the expectations of an institution that has decided in advance what she should be. She has fought that fight her entire married life, quietly and strategically and with a consistency that only becomes visible in retrospect. She is fighting it again now, but this time the person she is fighting for is not herself. It is her daughter. And that, by all accounts from everyone who knows her, makes her more determined rather than less. So this is where the story stands. A 13-year-old girl with a real gift and a growing dream. Two parents who have made it clear, in the language of action rather than declaration, that they intend to protect that dream. A queen who has her own ideas about what Charlotte's future should look like and has been applying quiet pressure in the direction of those ideas. A former insider who watched all of this and decided the public deserved to know it was happening. And an institution that has always preferred its internal conflicts to remain internal, that has always counted on silence as a form of control, finding that the silence it relied on is no longer entirely reliable. The outcome of all of this is not certain. History is full of talented people who were managed out of their dreams by institutions that valued conformity more than individuality, and history is also full of people who found a way through those institutions by patience and by time and by refusing, in the end, to be fully contained. Charlotte has years ahead of her. She has parents who are fighting for her. She has a natural talent that does not require anyone's permission to be real. What she also has, now, is visibility. The fact that this story exists, that a person inside the household felt it was important enough to speak about, that the pattern of interference has become clear enough to describe, that the public is now aware that something is being contested, changes the landscape slightly. Not dramatically. Not in a way that resolves anything. But, it means that the people applying the pressure are no longer doing so in complete darkness. It means that the narrowing, if it continues, will not go unnoticed. And, sometimes that is enough. Sometimes the knowledge that someone is watching, that the private maneuvers of powerful people are not as private as they believed, is enough to shift the calculation just far enough that a door that was being closed stays open a little longer. Long enough for the person it belongs to, the one who is still growing, still learning, still discovering the full dimensions of what she loves and what she is capable of, long enough for her to grow into it herself. Charlotte will not always be 13. One day she will be old enough to tell her own story, in her own words, in whatever form she chooses. The people who love her are working to make sure that when that day comes, the story she tells will be the one she chose, not the one that was chosen for her while she was too young to argue. That is the fight that is happening right now, behind the composed faces and the careful smiles and the palace walls that keep most of it from public view. It is not a fight with weapons or loud voices. It is quieter than that, and, in some ways, harder to watch precisely because of its quietness. But, it is real. It is ongoing. And, for a girl who loves stories, who understands, at some bone-deep level, the power of a narrative that refuses to be controlled by people who would prefer a different ending, there may be something fitting about the fact that her own story is being fought over so intensely. The best stories always are.